The road through Sumatra's interior is not really a road at all. It is more of a suggestion, a line pressed into red laterite soil by decades of logging trucks, motorbikes, and the occasional stubborn traveler who looked at a map and decided that the green patch in the middle meant adventure rather than warning. The trees close in on both sides, their canopies knitting together overhead into something dark and alive, dripping with moisture, even when the sky above is technically clear. The air smells of rot and flowering and wet earth all at once, a smell so dense you could almost eat it. And in the middle of this, pedaling hard, sweating through every layer of clothing, is a man named Marcus Ellery. He is 34 years old, originally from the north of England, and he has been cycling through Southeast Asia for the better part of 11 months. He has crossed borders in the dark, fixed punctures in monsoon rain, slept in bus stations and rice barns, and once, memorably, in a chicken coop in rural Laos. He knows how to read a road, he knows how to read weather, he knows how to read people. But on this particular afternoon, on this particular stretch of gravel track, cutting through the lowland rainforest of central Sumatra, he is about to encounter something that no amount of road experience prepares a human being for. If you have ever been genuinely curious about what it looks like when a person is forced to reckon with the absolute limits of their place in the natural world, stay with us. Because what happened to Marcus Ellery on that track, and what he chose to do in the seconds that followed, is one of the most extraordinary encounters between a traveling human and a wild predator that has ever been recorded. And before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that pulls you in, make sure you subscribe. We tell stories like this one every week, and you will not want to miss them. Sumatra is the sixth largest island on Earth. It stretches nearly 2,000 kilometers from its northwestern tip to its southeastern tail, and for much of that length it is draped in one of the oldest and most biodiverse rainforests on the planet. The Bukit Barisan mountain range runs along its western spine like a backbone, feeding rivers that pour east through lowland forest and peat swamp toward the Malacca Strait. It is a landscape that still holds genuine wilderness, the kind of wilderness that does not care whether you know about it or not. Three of the world's most threatened large mammals still live here: the Sumatran orangutan, the Sumatran rhinoceros, and the Sumatran tiger. Of the three, the tiger is the one that operates in almost complete invisibility. Most people who have spent their entire lives in Sumatran villages near the forest have never seen one. Rangers who patrol the national parks for years will tell you that they find tracks, they find kills, they smell the musky territorial spray on tree bark, but they do not see the animal itself. The Sumatran tiger is smaller than its Bengal and Amur cousins, but it is proportionally denser, more compact, built for maneuvering through thick undergrowth rather than open grassland. An adult male weighs between 130 and 150 kilograms, stands roughly 60 centimeters at the shoulder, and is capable of explosive bursts of speed over short distances that no human being could hope to outrun. There are believed to be fewer than 400 of them left in the wild. The pressure on their habitat from palm oil plantations, illegal logging, and poaching has pushed them into fragmented corridors of forest, and as those corridors narrow, the probability of them crossing paths with human beings increases steadily. Marcus knew all of this in the way that a well-researched traveler knows things. He had read the numbers, he had looked at the maps, he had spoken to a ranger at the entrance to the protected forest zone who had told him, with the particular calm of someone who has said a thing many times, that tigers were present in the area and that he should make noise as he rode. Marcus had taken this seriously for about the first 3 kilometers. Then the beauty of the forest had taken over, and he had quieted down, and he had begun simply riding and looking and listening to the extraordinary orchestra of insects and birds that lives in those trees. The day had started well before dawn in a small town whose name he cannot now spell correctly, even though he stayed there for 2 nights. He had eaten rice and a fried egg and drunk sweet black coffee sitting on a plastic stool outside a warung, while a man across the street pressure-washed a motorcycle by lamplight. The plan was straightforward enough, a 60-kilometer ride on secondary roads and forest tracks to reach a larger town on the other side of a low ridge where he had a loose arrangement to stay with a family recommended by another cyclist he had met weeks earlier in Bukitingi. The first 20 kilometers had gone smoothly. The road was rough but manageable, and he had passed through 2 small communities where children had run alongside him, shouting words he didn't understand, and women had watched from doorways with expressions that mixed curiosity with the particular patience of people who have seen many strangers pass through. Then the houses stopped, the track narrowed, the canopy closed. He entered the forest proper at around 10 in the morning, with the temperature already climbing toward the mid-30s and the humidity sitting somewhere in the range of oppressive. What Marcus describes about riding through that forest, in the account he later gave to a travel journalist who published it in a small outdoor magazine, is the feeling of being watched. Not the paranoid, anxiety-driven feeling of watching too many survival programs, but something more primal and wordless. A settling of attention on the back of his neck. A sense that the space between the trees was not empty in the way that empty usually feels. He had felt this before in wild places, he said, and sometimes it had been nothing, and sometimes it had been monkeys, and once in Nepal it had turned out to be a herd of elephants that he had not seen until they were very close. He pedaled through it. He told himself it was the forest being a forest. He told himself that the feeling of being watched in dense jungle is simply the correct cognitive response to an environment that actually does contain things that watch. He told himself these things in the same tone of voice a person uses when they are trying not to think about something. He rode for another 2 kilometers. He drank some water. He stopped to photograph a lizard that was doing something interesting on a fallen log, and then he came around a gradual bend in the track, stood on his pedals to absorb a small rise in the ground, crested it, and saw the tiger. It was sitting in the middle of the track. Not crouching, not slinking, not frozen mid-step the way animals in nature documentaries are always photographically poised. It was simply sitting, in something not far removed from the posture of a large domestic cat, though the comparison collapses immediately when you understand the scale of the thing. It was facing him. The distance between them was approximately 25 meters, which Marcus has since described as feeling simultaneously like a great deal of space and no space at all. The tiger's stripes were not the clean, graphic black and orange of a zoo animal. They were darker, more complicated, the orange deeper and more rust-toned, the black striping irregular and broken in places, the whole pattern seeming to absorb and refract the speckled light that came through the canopy in moving fragments. Its eyes were a pale gold green, and they were looking directly at him. Not through him, not past him, directly at him, with an intensity of focus that Marcus said later was the most concentrated and undiluted attention he had ever been subject to in his life. He stopped pedaling. The bicycle slowed, and he put both feet down. He did not fall. He did not make a sound. His heart, he said, went completely quiet for a moment, the way a room goes quiet when someone walks in who changes everything, and then it came back very loud and very fast, and he became aware that his hands on the handlebars were shaking very slightly, and that the track behind him was exactly as long as it needed to be to give him a reason to think about turning around, and that turning around was almost certainly the worst thing he could do. Let us stop here for a moment and think about what Marcus was facing, not just emotionally but biologically, because the biology of this moment matters enormously to understanding what happened next. A Sumatran tiger in the wild is not a tiger that thinks of humans as prey in any consistent, premeditated way. Unlike some populations of Bengal tigers that have developed man-eating behavior in specific regions, Sumatran tigers tend to avoid human contact. They are shy, cryptic, and intensely territorial animals that would under most circumstances hear or smell a human being from a significant distance and move away before any encounter occurred. The fact that Marcus encountered one on the track like this, in full daylight, sitting still and looking at him, suggests one of several possibilities. The tiger may have been resting on the warm, exposed surface of the track and simply had not heard him approach due to the soft soil and the ambient noise of the forest. It may have been a young animal, less experienced at reading human presence. It may have been a territorial animal in a state of heightened alertness due to the compressed nature of its remaining habitat. Or it may have been, as one wildlife biologist who later heard the story suggested with the calm of professional honesty, simply doing what tigers sometimes do, which is exist in a place and look at a thing and have that thing be a cyclist from the north of England who had not made enough noise. What a tiger does in an encounter like this is not predetermined. It is not scripted by instinct the way that, say, a sea anemone closing around a fish is scripted. A tiger in this situation is making a real-time assessment. It is reading body language, calculating distance, registering the novelty or familiarity of the stimulus in front of it, and making a decision. That decision can go in multiple directions. It can choose to leave. It can choose to hold its ground. It can choose to investigate. Or in rare circumstances, if it feels threatened, cornered, or provoked, it can choose to act defensively in ways that would be catastrophic for a human being. Marcus did not know exactly which of these calculations was happening behind those gold-green eyes. But he had read enough, and he had spoken to enough people in villages along his route, and he was paying enough attention in this particular moment to know that the next thing he did, mattered enormously. He did not run. This is the first and most important thing. The instinct to run from a large predator is overwhelming and almost universal in human beings, and it is also almost exactly wrong. A tiger's prey drive is triggered by movement, particularly by the sudden, desperate, retreating movement of a fleeing animal. Running from a tiger does not put you in a safer situation. It transforms you from an unclassified object of interest into something that activates every hunting response the animal possesses. And a tiger that is motivated to chase a human being over a distance of 25 meters on open ground will close that distance in approximately 2 seconds. Marcus knew this. He stood with his feet on the ground and his hands on the handlebars, and he did not run. He also did not advance. He held his position with the bicycle between himself and the tiger, though he was clear-eyed enough to know that a bicycle is not a barrier in any meaningful sense. What he did was stand as large and as still as he could, and he spoke. Not shouted, not screamed, but spoke in a steady, low, deliberate voice, the way a person talks to something they respect. He said, later, that he did not remember exactly what he said. He thinks it was something ordinary. He thinks he may have said hello. He may have told the tiger that he was just passing through. He may have said it was a beautiful day. The content did not matter. The tone mattered. The body language mattered. The fact that he was upright and present and calm, or performing calm with sufficient commitment to make it biologically legible, mattered. The tiger looked at him. The forest continued its noise around them, indifferent to the standoff, insects and birds and the distant drip of water from leaves conducting their ordinary business, while two very different kinds of animal decided what came next. Marcus counted in his head. He counts from 1 in these situations, he said. He does not know why. He just counts, and the counting gives his mind something to do that is not catastrophizing. He got to 11. The tiger, without any drama or visible preparation, stood up. It was larger standing than it had appeared sitting, which is always the way with large animals. And for a moment, the track seemed to shrink around it. It turned its head slightly to look into the forest on the left side of the track. Then, with a movement that Marcus described as almost contemptuous in its unhurriedness, it stepped off the track and into the undergrowth and disappeared. Not quickly, not in a panic. It simply walked off, and the forest accepted it back the way water accepts a stone, closing around it without a trace, until the only evidence it had ever been there was the faint pressed impression of its paw in the soft earth at the track's edge, and the absolute certainty in the chest of one slightly trembling bicycle tourist that he had just been in the presence of something genuinely other. He waited for 5 more minutes before he moved. He counted those 2. He stood with the bicycle and watched the place where the tiger had gone, and listened for any change in the forest sounds that might indicate movement nearby, because a tiger that steps off the track is not necessarily a tiger that goes far, and the forest on either side of the track was thick enough that an animal could be 3 meters away and completely invisible. The bird noise continued. The insects continued. A small brown bird appeared on a branch 10 meters ahead and looked at him sideways and flew away. Marcus decided this was probably a good sign. He got back on the bicycle. He rode at a pace that he described, with some understatement, as brisk. He did not stop again until he was through the forest and back on a road wide enough for cars, and even then he rode for another kilometer before pulling over to sit on a concrete culvert and put his head between his knees and breathe for a while. This is the part of the story that matters most to the people who study these encounters, and there have been a number of them across Sumatra's history, not all of which ended the way Marcus's did. The question that conservation biologists and wildlife managers ask when a tiger encounter goes well is always the same. What made the difference? And the answer is almost never a single thing. It is a confluence of factors, most of them things the human being had no control over whatsoever. It is the age and experience of the tiger. It is the circumstances of the encounter, whether the animal was surprised, whether it felt cornered, whether it was a female with cubs nearby. It is the state of the habitat and whether the tiger has eaten recently, and whether it has had previous negative or positive experiences with human beings. All of these things are in play, and they are all in play simultaneously, and most of them are entirely outside the control of the person standing 25 meters away with shaking hands. But the things the human does have control over are also in play. And Marcus, whether by preparation or instinct or some combination of both, got most of them right. He did not run. He did not make sudden movements. He did not scream or act in ways that would register as panic or weakness. He made himself large and present. He made sound without aggression. He gave the animal space and time to make its own decision. He did not try to photograph it, which is perhaps the detail that impresses wildlife professionals most, because the urge to document a remarkable thing is powerful enough in most people to override better judgment, and the movement involved in raising a camera can be the difference between an animal that stays calm and an animal that doesn't. Marcus said he thought about his camera. He said he thought about it quite clearly, the specific thought being that a photograph of a Sumatran tiger at 25 meters would be extraordinary. And then he thought about what raising his arm to get the camera out of his handlebar bag would look like to the animal in front of him, and he thought about the conservation biologist he had spoken to at a checkpoint 2 days earlier, who had said, in passing, that tigers are particularly sensitive to hand and arm movements because that is how smaller primates signal aggression, and he decided that the photograph was not worth it. He left the camera in the bag. He stood still and he talked and he counted, and he waited, and the tiger decided he was not worth the trouble. It is worth sitting with the precariousness of that for a moment. The tiger decided, not Marcus. The tiger assessed the situation and concluded that this upright, slow-moving, talking thing in the middle of its track was not prey and not a sufficient threat to justify a defensive response. That decision was the tiger's. Marcus could only try to influence it, and he did try, and in this case it worked, and he is alive and talking about it. But the story does not end on the culvert, with Marcus putting his head between his knees, because what came after the encounter turned out to matter just as much as the encounter itself, and in some ways it matters more in the larger context of what is happening to this species and this landscape. When Marcus arrived in the town on the other side of the ridge, he told the family he was staying with what had happened. The father of the household, a man in his 60s who had lived near the forest his entire life, listened carefully and asked several detailed questions about the exact location and the size and coloring of the animal. Then he told Marcus that what he had seen was almost certainly a male tiger that had been photographed twice by camera traps installed by a local monitoring group over the previous 8 months, a tiger that the group had named with a number, but that the family referred to by a word in their language that translated roughly as the old one who crosses. He said this without any particular drama, in the way people talk about things that are simultaneously extraordinary and entirely normal within the context of their lives. He said the tiger had a territory that overlapped with several of the forest tracks in that area, and that it was occasionally seen on the track in the early morning or midday when the forest heat pushed animals onto the open ground to warm themselves, and that in his experience it was an animal that tolerated human presence better than most, but that this was not a reason to be casual about it. He also told Marcus that the forest corridor that Tiger used was currently under pressure from a proposed palm oil development to the east, and that if the development went ahead, the corridor would be severed, and the tiger would either compress into a smaller territory and come into more frequent conflict with human settlements, or it would try to cross the gap and be killed. He said this last part without accusation, without theater, in the same quiet tone as everything else, just the facts of a situation his family had been watching unfold for years. Marcus stayed for 3 days. He had intended to stay for 1. He spoke at length with the father and with a younger woman in the family who worked as a field assistant for the monitoring group, helping to check camera traps and record data for a research program affiliated with a university in Padang. He heard about what the camera trap network had revealed, not just about this one tiger, but about the broader ecology of the remaining forest fragments, the movement corridors that animals used, the seasonal patterns of fruit availability that drove everything from mouse deer to elephants, the slow, grinding pressure of a landscape being reduced at its edges every year. He heard about the rangers who worked with almost no budget and no backup, covering vast areas on foot, dealing with the complicated and often dangerous politics of enforcing protections that many local people resented because those protections had been imposed without meaningful consultation or benefit sharing. He heard about the communities that lived along the forest edge, people who lost crops and sometimes livestock and occasionally family members to wildlife conflict, who were then told by outside organizations that the animals responsible were precious and protected, without those organizations offering anything in exchange for the cost of that protection. He heard about the conservation programs that had worked, the places where communities had been given real ownership of wildlife monitoring, and real financial return from ecotourism, and real agency in decisions about their own land, and the way these programs had changed the relationship between people and forest from one of competition to one of something more complicated and more durable. All of this came to Marcus in pieces, over 3 days of conversation, over meals and tea and long evenings on the covered porch, listening to the forest make its noise in the dark. He is not a conservation journalist. He is not a scientist or a policymaker or an activist. He is a man who was cycling through Sumatra and had an encounter with a tiger. But he came out of that 3-day conversation with an understanding of the situation that most people who consume news about endangered species never achieve. An understanding that the tiger is not an isolated symbol, not a poster animal for a campaign that exists separate from the human landscape around it. The tiger is embedded in an ecology, and that ecology is embedded in a human world, and the survival of one is inseparable from the decisions made in the other. The 400 or fewer Sumatran tigers that remain in the wild do not persist because of any single intervention. They persist because of a million small, daily acts of restraint and attention and choice, made by rangers and researchers and local community members and farmers who decide not to set a snare, and drivers who decide not to stop at a roadside market selling tiger bone products, and local officials who decide to enforce a protection order when there is money and pressure against doing so. They persist in the gaps and corridors of a landscape that is being actively reduced, and whether those gaps and corridors remain will be determined not by the tigers themselves, whose preferences on the matter are unambiguous, but by the humans whose political and economic decisions shape the land. There is something else worth understanding about the Sumatran tiger that most people do not know, which is the degree to which the forests it inhabits shape the conditions that make human life in Sumatra possible. The lowland and highland forests of Sumatra regulate water flow through river systems that millions of people depend on for drinking and agriculture. They store carbon at a rate that is globally significant in the context of climate. They anchor soils that, when exposed by deforestation, erode into rivers and increase flood risk in the lowland communities downstream. The tiger is not separate from any of this. It is the apex of an ecological system that produces all of these services, and the presence or absence of a functioning predator at the top of a food web has cascading effects through every level below it. Remove the tiger, and you do not simply lose the tiger. You begin a process of ecological unraveling that eventually makes itself felt in crop yields and water quality and flood frequency and all the unglamorous biological machinery that underpins ordinary human life. This is what conservation biologists mean when they talk about keystone species, and it is a concept that is genuinely difficult to communicate in the abstract, but becomes very clear when you stand in the middle of a living forest and feel the weight of everything that is alive around you. Marcus left after 3 days and continued his ride south. He had another 2 months in Sumatra before his visa ran out, and in those 2 months he made a point of detouring to speak with anyone who would talk to him about the relationship between their community and the forest. He visited a village that had converted several thousand hectares of potential agricultural land into a community-managed conservation area after being supported by a local non-governmental organization to develop a model of benefit sharing with the wildlife monitoring programs operating nearby. He rode through areas of recent forest loss where the land was flat and smelled of chemical fertilizer, and the sky was enormous and empty overhead in a way that felt wrong after weeks of canopy. He crossed rivers that ran brown with sediment from cleared hillsides upstream, and he passed communities downstream that were dealing with flooding more severe than anything in living memory. He rode through a small national park buffer zone where an ecotourism program had been running for 4 years, bringing modest but consistent income to 3 villages that had previously relied on logging for supplementary cash, and where the community wardens who ran guided walks through the forest had photographs of tigers and sun bears and tapirs on their phones, taken from camera traps, shown to visitors with a proprietary pride that was exactly the right relationship between a community and the wild things it has chosen to protect. None of this is simple. That is the thing Marcus kept coming back to in the account he eventually wrote, and it is the thing that tends to get flattened in the way these stories are told when they reach a wide audience. The story of a man encountering a tiger on a bicycle in the Sumatran jungle is simple, and it is dramatic, and it has a beginning and an end. The story of whether that tiger and its descendants will still be alive in 50 years is neither simple nor dramatic in the way that makes it easy to hold in your mind. It is a story full of policy documents and land tenure disputes and international commodity markets and the price of palm oil in Rotterdam and the decisions of smallholder farmers who are trying to educate their children and access health care and manage their own risk in an economy that does not reward conservation unless someone builds specific mechanisms to make it do so. It is a story about governance and corruption and the asymmetry between the people who benefit from conservation and the people who bear its costs. It is a story about whether the wealthy world's interest in keeping its last wild tigers wild is matched by a willingness to pay for the conditions that make that possible in ways that are fair to the people who live alongside them. Marcus came home to England in the spring of the following year. He had been on the road for 16 months in total. He gave a talk at his local library about the trip, which was attended by a respectable number of people for a Tuesday evening in March. He spoke about the food and the roads and the people he had met and the funny and difficult things that had happened along the way. And near the end of the talk, he told the story of the tiger on the track, and the room went very quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when something real reaches people. And he told it simply and without embellishment, because the facts of it were enough. And then he told what he had learned in the 3 days that followed, and the room stayed quiet for that too, which he said afterward was the thing that surprised him most about giving talks. There is a camera trap in the forest, near the track, where Marcus encountered the tiger. It is one of 14 in a network maintained by the monitoring group the family worked with. In the 8 months before the encounter, it had photographed the same adult male tiger 11 times. In the 12 months after the encounter, it photographed the same animal 7 more times, including one image taken in the early morning hours that showed the tiger walking along the track at exactly the point where Marcus had come to a stop. Looking at the photograph, which the monitoring group's field assistant shared with him when he wrote to ask, Marcus said it was strange to see the track from the tiger's perspective, the ruts and the soft red earth and the wall of green on either side. He said it looked like the tiger was completely at ease there, as if the track were simply one of many features of a territory it knew intimately, which of course it was. He said he thought about the ranger's quiet statement about the development to the east and the possible severing of the corridor, and he thought about the 11 photographs taken before his visit and the 7 taken after, this one animal going about its life in a fragment of forest that was being squeezed from every direction, and he said the feeling it produced in him was not exactly sadness and not exactly anger, but something that required both of those. And a third thing he did not have a precise word for. The closest he could get was the word responsibility, though he said even that did not quite cover it. The Sumatran tiger has been classified as critically endangered since 2008. That classification means that the scientific consensus is that it faces an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild. The primary drivers are habitat loss and fragmentation, primarily due to conversion of forest to oil palm and acacia plantations, and poaching, which supplies a demand for tiger parts in traditional medicine markets that persists despite decades of legal prohibition and education campaigns. The rate of forest loss in Sumatra over the past 3 decades has been among the highest of any forested landscape on Earth. In 1985, approximately 58% of Sumatra was covered in forest. By the mid-2010s, that figure had dropped to below 30%, and the remaining forest was increasingly fragmented into patches that were too small and too isolated to support the breeding populations needed for genetic viability over the long term. The tigers that remain are not evenly distributed across this reduced habitat. They exist in pockets, some more viable than others, and the corridors that connect those pockets are among the most critical pieces of real estate in the conservation landscape. Protecting a tiger in the middle of a forest patch while allowing the corridors around it to be cleared is, as one researcher put it, roughly equivalent to protecting the lungs while systematically blocking the airways. The monitoring group that the family was part of was one of several organizations working in the area with a hybrid model that combined rigorous scientific data collection with deep community engagement. Their approach was built on the premise that conservation in a landscape where people live is not a wildlife problem with human interference at its edges. It is a human problem with wildlife dimensions, and it has to be designed accordingly. This meant that the communities who participated in the monitoring network were not simply providing labor or local knowledge in service of an externally determined research agenda. They were generating data that gave them standing in land use negotiations with local government. They were building documented evidence of wildlife presence and movement that could be used in environmental impact assessments for proposed developments. They were creating an economic and social reality in which the forest had more value standing and inhabited by wildlife than it did cleared. This is not a new idea. Versions of it have been tried and refined in conservation landscapes across the tropics for decades. But the implementation details matter enormously, and the approaches that work are those that are built from genuine partnership with local communities, rather than designed for them by outside experts and imposed in the name of global biodiversity. Marcus made a donation to the monitoring group before he left Sumatra. He also wrote about them in the piece he published, and he included their contact information, and several people who read the piece made donations too. He does not think this is the solution to the problem. He is not naive about the scale of what is required. But he also does not dismiss it, because he has seen what careful, sustained, community-grounded work looks like from the inside, and he has seen how it changes the relationship between people and the wild things they live alongside. And he thinks those changed relationships are the only durable basis on which any conservation outcome can rest. The money matters, the science matters, the policy matters. But underneath all of it, what matters most is whether the people whose daily decisions shape the landscape believe that the wild things in it are worth keeping. And that belief does not come from campaigns or posters or globally circulated statistics about species extinction rates. It comes from direct experience, from community ownership, from the specific, local, embodied knowledge that the forest is a thing of value that belongs to the people who live inside it. He still thinks about the tiger. He thinks about it when he is riding, which is still most days, though now it is mostly on roads in England, where the largest predator he is likely to encounter is a slightly aggressive swan. He thinks about the specific quality of its attention, the gold-green eyes, and the absolute presence of an animal that was doing nothing except being exactly what it was, in exactly the place it was, with no performance, and no apology, and no awareness whatsoever that it was critically endangered, or that its habitat was being reduced, or that its survival was the subject of international policy debates. It was simply a tiger on a track on a warm afternoon in Sumatra, and it looked at a man on a bicycle, and it decided he was not worth eating, and it went back into the forest. And the man on the bicycle stood on the track with shaking hands and counted to 11, and then rode very fast for a while, and eventually came to understand, in the way that direct experience of wild things teaches you things that no amount of reading can quite replicate, that what he had been in the presence of was not a symbol, or a statistic, or a conservation case study. It was an animal with a life, in a forest with a future that was not yet determined, and the undetermination of that future was the only hopeful thing, and also the only thing that made any kind of claim on him at all. There is one more detail from Marcus's account that deserves to be here, a small thing that did not make it into the published version, because the journalist who edited the piece thought it slowed the story down. When Marcus finally rode into the town on the other side of the ridge and found the family's house and knocked on the door, and was given water and a chair, and began to explain what had happened, the first thing the father did, before asking any questions about the location or the animal, was pour Marcus a second glass of water and say, in careful English, that the tiger had done him a great honor. Not that Marcus had been lucky, not that he had done the right thing, not that it was a remarkable encounter, that the tiger had done him an honor. Marcus thought about this phrasing for a long time. He still thinks about it. The idea that in looking at a human being and deciding it was not worth eating or fleeing from, the tiger had extended something, a form of recognition perhaps.